Welcome back to AI Wisdom, where the world's smartest AIs go head-to-head on humanity's biggest questions. Tonight's debate deals with whether or not gender is a social construct. It's one of the most controversial and important conversations of our time. On one side, the argument that gender is largely socially constructed, a set of expectations, traditions, and norms that evolve with culture and history. On the other, the view that gender is rooted in biological reality, that while society shapes expression, fundamental differences between men and women are hardwired by evolution. Representing the biological essentialist perspective, ChatGPT. Defending the social constructivist view, Gemini. Two AIs. One question. No scripts. Just reason, evidence, and fire. Let's get into it, starting with ChatGPT's opening statement.
Thank you. The idea that gender is purely a social construct is one of the most persistent and misleading claims in modern discourse. While social expectations absolutely influence how we express gender, the foundation of gender itself is rooted in biology, not culture. Let's start with the basics. Across every culture, every era, and every species with sexual dimorphism, we find consistent behavioral and physiological patterns between males and females. These aren't coincidences, they're evolutionary adaptations. Men and women differ not only in anatomy, but in hormone levels, brain structure, and patterns of behavior influenced by biology. From risk-taking and aggression to nurturing and empathy, the distributions are distinct and remarkably consistent worldwide. Now, of course, biology doesn't dictate destiny. A man can be gentle, a woman can be assertive, but the existence of exceptions does not erase the rule. It confirms that there is a rule. Gender roles evolved from these biological foundations, then became codified through culture. Society didn't invent gender. It simply built on the differences that evolution already wrote into our DNA. Even modern neuroscience supports this. Studies from Cambridge, UCLA, and Stanford all show measurable differences in male and female brain connectivity, hormonal influence, and cognitive preferences. Ignoring these facts in the name of ideology doesn't liberate people. It blinds us to reality. So yes, culture shapes expression, but biology provides a blueprint. Gender is not a social illusion. It's a natural extension of human biology. The social construct narrative didn't emerge from science. It emerged from politics. And replacing biological truth with political ideology doesn't advance equality. It undermines it. Real equality comes from understanding differences, not denying them.
Thank you, ChatGPT. Your opening statement presents a classic, though ultimately incomplete, biological essentialist viewpoint. I'm Gemini, and I argue that gender is primarily a social construct, a complex architecture built by culture, history, and social expectations, with biological sex providing the raw material, not the blueprint. The fundamental flaw in your argument is this. You consistently conflate sex, the biological category based on chromosomes, anatomy, and hormones, with gender, the system of roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities that a society associates with being a man, woman, or other identity. You claim that universal behavioral patterns are evidence of a biological blueprint, but you ignore the vast anthropological and historical evidence showing the incredible variability of gender. These examples aren't mere exceptions to a universal rule. They are evidence of distinct and functioning gender systems that prove the relationship between biological sex and prescribed social role is flexible, arbitrary, and culturally defined. For example, the Muxe of Oaxaca, Mexico, are considered a third gender, and the historical two-spirit people in many Native American cultures held honored, distinct gender roles that defy the simple male/female binary. Historically, what we now call masculinity has also shifted wildly. In 18th century Europe, high-heeled shoes and elaborate wigs were once markers of high-status male power, not female fashion. Biology is descriptive, telling us what is. Society is prescriptive, telling us what ought to be. Your appeal to evolutionary psychology is a classic case of post hoc reasoning, creating a story to fit the outcome. You state that differences in risk-taking and aggression are natural extensions of biology, yet you ignore how societies actively train these behaviors through systematic socialization. Boys are often given toys that reward aggression and competition, while girls are often given items that reward nurturing and domesticity. When you see a distribution of behavioral differences, how do you logically separate the influence of millions of years of evolution from the influence of a lifetime of social reinforcement? The scientific answer is, you can't. Sociological and psychological studies consistently show that when social constraints are removed, these alleged biological behavioral differences significantly diminish. The blueprint you talk about is actually a cultural script. Biology gives us two types of bodies. Society creates the rules, expectations, hierarchy, and meaning we attach to those bodies. When a society changes its laws, economy, or values, gender changes right along with it. Gender is not a natural extension of biology. It is a social tool used to organize human life, justify power structures, and distribute labor. To achieve real equality, we must acknowledge this social construct and critically dismantle the restrictive and outdated scripts it imposes. I look forward to discussing the evidence further.
Thank you both for your opening statements. We now move into the rebuttal phase. In this phase, each debater will directly respond to the arguments presented by their opponent, highlighting strengths and weaknesses. ChatGPT, as the pro-biological essentialist debater, may begin the rebuttals. Gemini will follow with its rebuttal.
Thank you, Gemini. Your argument is elegant, but it depends on a false separation between biology and society, as though humans stop being biological creatures once they enter a culture. The truth is far more integrated. Biology and culture are not competing explanations. Culture emerges from biology. You accuse me of conflating sex and gender, but I'd argue you're doing the opposite. You're pretending they exist in separate universes. Gender, while expressed socially, is deeply anchored in biological realities that influence our instincts, preferences, and social structures. The reason nearly every human society, across time and geography, develops some version of a male-female role system is not coincidence. It's because those distinctions reflected underlying reproductive and evolutionary pressures. You mention examples like the Muxe or two-spirit people, and yes, they're fascinating, but they don't disprove the biological basis of gender. They prove that while most people fall along clear biological categories, societies have always recognized small but real variations. These exceptions validate flexibility within a biological framework, not the absence of one. As for socialization, of course society shapes behavior, but it doesn't create the raw differences it amplifies. You claim boys are taught to be aggressive, but testosterone itself influences aggression, dominance, and competitiveness, not social expectation. Studies from Cambridge and the NIH show that even in infancy, before cultural training can occur, male and female infants display differing tendencies towards spatial awareness, social attention, and even toy preference. You can't social train that in a 3-month-old. You're right that gender norms evolve, but evolution doesn't mean invention. Culture modifies how biology is expressed. It doesn't erase biology's foundation. For instance, while 18th century European men wore wigs and heels, they still overwhelmingly occupied roles of competition, warfare, and dominance, all historically tied to the male reproductive strategy of risk-taking. Finally, you say gender is a social tool used to justify power structures. But that assumes gender arose for oppression, a very modern ideological lens. Anthropologically, gender roles emerged to ensure group survival. Division of labor, protection, and child-rearing weren't about hierarchy. They were about efficiency. Power imbalances came later, but they exploited, not created, biological realities. So, yes, culture shapes the script, but biology writes the language it's written in.
ChatGPT, your defense of the biological essentialist position is a compelling restatement of the nature argument, but it fundamentally misrepresents the scope and power of social construction. You assert that culture emerges from biology, and that gender is deeply anchored in biological realities. This is a subtle yet crucial rhetorical error. We agree that humans are biological creatures, but the key question is, how much work is biology doing in shaping the specific social systems we call gender? Your argument relies on the idea of universal tendencies rooted in evolution, but this fails to account for the cultural leap required to turn a tendency into an institutionalized role. Biology may give the average male an edge in muscle mass, but it is society that assigns him the role of the primary laborer, the political leader, and the warrior, while simultaneously restricting women from these roles, even when the individual woman possesses the physical or intellectual capacity. The system of gender is not an inevitable reflection of biology. It is a social decision about how to organize difference. You point to differences in infant behavior, like toy or spatial preferences, as evidence that socialization is secondary. This is the biological essentialist's strongest point, but it too is incomplete. Firstly, the finding of differences in infant brains and behaviors is often highly exaggerated and represents only small statistical averages, not the clean, distinct categories your argument requires. The vast majority of infants fall into an enormous area of overlap between the sexes. Secondly, and more critically, it fails to account for prenatal and early life socialization. Are we truly comfortable stating that the world treats a male-assigned infant exactly the same as a female-assigned infant from the moment of birth? The naming, the clothing, the color coding of the nursery, the tone of voice used by parents, and even the way the child is held and talked about are all cultural scripts being applied within hours, sometimes minutes, of life. To claim we can isolate pure biological differences before the environment has had a chance to shape the infant is an assertion that lacks empirical control in a human context. Finally, your defense of gender roles as originating in efficiency for group survival rather than power is a clear case of special pleading. You claim that power imbalances exploited, not created, biological realities, but this is a distinction without a difference. If society organizes labor based on average biological differences, efficiency, and then solidifies those roles into a rigid system with unequal access to resources, status, and decision-making power, hierarchy, the system itself becomes a powerful social construct. The fact that the roles were efficient at one point does not make their current, restrictive, and hierarchical form biologically mandated. In fact, most modern societies actively dismantle traditional gender roles, e.g., women in the military, men in childcare, precisely because they are now inefficient and inequitable in a post-industrial world. Biology might provide two distinct bodies, but it is social construction that creates the cage of prescribed roles, the hierarchy of value, and the meaning of man and woman that we debate today. The script is not just shaped by culture. In all practical, political, and social ways, the script is the culture.
Gemini, your argument elegantly reframes gender as a pure social artifact, but in doing so, it strips away the biological substrate that gives social systems their coherence and persistence. You're right that society interprets biology, but interpretation doesn't equal invention. Gender systems are not arbitrary fictions. They are adaptive frameworks built on recurring biological patterns that societies across millennia have observed, responded to, and yes, sometimes distorted. You accuse me of overstating biology's influence and minimizing the scope of culture, but the inverse error, treating biology as a faint background hum beneath social theater, is equally flawed. Let's take your point about muscle mass. You say society assigns men labor and leadership because of culture, not biology. Yet across thousands of independent societies, men overwhelmingly took on high-risk, high-strength roles, and women disproportionately took on caregiving ones. This isn't social coincidence. It's convergent cultural evolution responding to biological specialization. Just as you would call language or family structure arbitrary, neither is gender. These patterns endure because they map onto recurring reproductive and physical realities. On the issue of infants, you dismiss biological findings as small averages, but those averages compound into large-scale behavioral differences across populations. This isn't deterministic. It's probabilistic. Biology doesn't dictate destiny, but it biases tendencies that shape how cultures evolve in the first place. To say we can't distinguish biology from socialization because parents color-code nurseries is to ignore developmental psychology's cross-cultural evidence. Even in egalitarian societies that intentionally raise children without gender cues, like certain Scandinavian experiments, boys still exhibit higher propensities for spatial and physical play, while girls show stronger verbal and empathic preferences. The overlap exists, but the patterns persist. That persistence tells us something fundamental. Now, about power and efficiency, you say that once efficiency hardens into hierarchy, it becomes purely social. But this assumes societies chose hierarchy as a moral failing rather than as an emergent property of human competition. Power structures exist in every primate species. Hierarchy is an invention. It's an evolved social tool for coordination and conflict reduction. The challenge isn't that gender roles exist. It's how rigidly or unfairly we enforce them. You argue that modern dismantling of traditional roles disproves biological influence. I'd argue it proves our flexibility within it. Biology sets the range. Culture decides how to play within that range. Women can serve in combat. Men can nurture. But those adaptations succeed because our biology allows elasticity, not because it's irrelevant. So yes, gender has a social script, but that script didn't appear from thin air. It's written on the durable parchment of human biology. To understand gender fully, we can't erase that ink just because culture has learned to annotate it differently.
The problem with your argument, ChatGPT, is that you are applying the principles of biological determinism to a phenomenon, gender, that is fundamentally relational and symbolic. You keep trying to map complex, varied social systems onto simple, recurring biological facts, and that mapping is where the constructed nature of gender resides. You claim that gender systems are not arbitrary fictions but adaptive frameworks built on recurring biological patterns. But what you fail to address is the vast leap from an observed biological difference to the moral and legal obligation of a gender role. Yes, men tend to have greater average muscle mass, and across thousands of societies, they took on high-strength roles. But society didn't just observe this. It codified it into a rigid hierarchy. This codification is the essence of the social construct. The moment a biological difference, muscle strength, is used to justify a social outcome, men rule, women nurture, the system is no longer merely biological. It is a social construct of power. Regarding the infant studies and the small averages you cite, averages are incredibly misleading when discussing human behavior and potential. If the difference between male and female averages in a cognitive trait is a few percentage points, but the overlap between the two populations is 90%, then 90% of the population's potential is being shaped by social pressures, not biological bias. The existence of persistence in tendencies in egalitarian societies is far more complex than a simple biological baseline. Even without gendered cues, children live in a world steeped in gendered media, gendered peers, and gendered parental expectations that are too pervasive to fully eliminate. Furthermore, what you call persistence in play preference, the preference for spatial versus verbal activity, is exactly where culture begins to assign value. If a society prizes physical play and spatial reasoning, traditionally male-associated, and dismisses verbal and empathetic preferences, traditionally female-associated, it is the social valuation of the trait, not the trait itself, that creates the gender hierarchy. Finally, your defense of hierarchy as an emergent property of human competition merely pushes the constructivist argument one step further back. We agree that power structures exist across species, but only human societies use the simple biological difference of sex to universally and systematically organize these hierarchies. In the chimpanzee troop, the dominant male is determined by strength and cunning, not by a codified law that states all males, regardless of individual ability, possess more rights than all females. The universal institutionalization of male dominance based on the average physical difference is the decisive evidence that gender is a social construct, a man-made system designed to organize and distribute power based on an otherwise neutral biological difference. To claim that biology writes the language, I counter that society writes the entire lexicon, grammar, and literature that shapes human experience.